Okay, perfect. Thank you so much for joining me today. You know, I can talk to one person about this topic. I can talk to 100 people about this topic. It's like singing the same song over and over again because I think it's so important that we have this conversation. And so today, thank you for that warm welcome, by the way, Audrey. I really appreciate it. What I wanted to do is to highlight what I've seen in the last few years is what I've called a movement. I call it the civility revolution. And what I've seen happen is that we've seen a growing awareness happening where people recognize that what incivility does, right? Not in the practice of law, but in the workplace, in our communities, to our mental health, our overall well-being. And so we're seeing more of that happening, and we're also seeing a growing desire for positive change, as well as a demand for inclusive, equitable work environments. So what I wanted to do is start out by sharing 3 key observations that I've seen in my career as an employment law attorney, but also as a workplace consultant for culture. So I deal with organizations all over the globe, advising them on culture. And so the 3 things that I've seen, and I wanted to highlight for all of you, is that we've seen a significant shift in values. So we're seeing civility is something that was never talked about in our practice of law, never talked about in the workplaces, and now people are actually prioritizing civility. And a lot of that has to do with the internet, right? We've seen an increased proliferation of uncivil behavior, and now when you have at your fingertips, you're hiding behind a screen, or you're hiding behind a phone, it's much easier to be uncivil than those face-to-face interactions. So it's skyrocketing. And people have recognized that, wait a second, what used to happen behind closed doors is not behind closed doors anymore. So there's online communities, social media, where people are talking about this information, and now people are being held accountable for their behaviors in ways that they never were before. Also, what we've seen is that workplaces have recognized that civility has a tremendous impact on the employees within the workplace. So if we allow civility to continue, now we have unhappy employees that are not motivated, productivity suffers, we have lack of innovation, and it hits the bottom line. So it's getting the attention of the decision makers. Now they're recognizing, guess what, the great resignation, right, or quiet resignation. People are not going to tolerate these behaviors anymore. And that's the second observation. We've seen that the tolerance level for these, what I call uncivil behaviors, things like rude, insensitive behaviors, things like bullying, that are not necessarily illegal per se in the state of California, but that are still detrimental to the workplace. So now we're seeing employers actually take this topic very seriously and put money behind the resources to educate their staff, to educate their teams on what uncivil behavior is. We're seeing practices, we're seeing these holistic approaches come to light, which I'll tell you, and I was telling this gentleman up here earlier that when I started my company in 2017, I gave myself the title of Chief Civility Officer. And I looked online, I looked at LinkedIn, and I did a search. Does anybody else have this title? And there wasn't a single person that had that title. Nobody was talking about civility in the workplace or in the practice of law in 2017. And now we have a significant shift. The third major shift that I've seen is that the civility movement goes hand in hand with the broader diversity and inclusion movement. Right? So if we want people from all walks of life to feel welcome, to feel valued, then it's imperative that they expect civility in their interactions. That's the way that we're going to undo the stereotypes, the prejudices that are already out there, when we can create environments where people can have conversations openly, can share their opinions, even if we disagree, in a respectful way. So with these 3 shifts in mind, the question then becomes for all of us is, well, why is civility important for all of us in the legal world? Well, civility really is the foundation, right? It's the bedrock underneath all of the work that we're out there doing. We are here to pursue justice, fairness, and equality in the favor of law. And so we are all the reason why I love doing this topic with all of you today is because we're not bystanders. We have to be the ones actually leading the way. And so my goal today is to really give you some practical tips on how you can incorporate civility into the work that you're doing so that you can have enhanced client relations, you can have improved outcomes, and you can have better work environments. And so if any of you have heard me speaking before, and I know, Audrey, you have, I really believe that it's important to give practical tips and guidance. So my goal is to empower you so that you can take these things back to your organizations or to the opposing counsels you're dealing with, the clients you're dealing with. Because at the end of the day, we have to be the ones at the forefront of moving this needle forward, right, as legal representatives. We're the ones that our clients are looking to enforce these outcomes that we're looking for. And so it starts with this conversation of what is incivility, right? In order for us to understand what civility is and how do we get to civility, we first have to start with understanding the root causes of incivility. And so when I first started speaking in this area and doing my workshops in this area, I would ask this question to people: what is incivility? And I would get a whole range of answers, right? And then I would look at the policy for the organization, for the law firm, and there would be nothing in that policy outlining what to do if you saw those behaviors happening in that workplace. What we saw was your anti-harassment, anti-discrimination policy, which talks about your illegal behaviors, right? But what about all those behaviors that are short of illegal behaviors? So I would like to introduce all of you to what I call is the uncivil behavior spectrum. So as you see on here, incivility is really a whole range of behaviors. It starts with what I call behaviors of concern. And in that category, I'm putting all things like rude behavior, insensitive behavior. I'm also including in there things like microaggressions that stem from your unconscious bias. So I found a huge gap in what we were doing to bring civility into our organizations, into our workplaces, into our practice of law, when we weren't even teaching people what incivility was and what to do in those situations. So that was really frustrating for me because what I saw happening is, attorneys, how they were interacting with each other, how they were interacting with their clients, how they were interacting with judges. I saw a lot of incivility when I was practicing law. So for a majority of my career, the first 10 years, I was a defense attorney. So I was representing supervisors and leaders in court, dealing primarily with harassment discrimination cases. And I saw rude behaviors. I saw microaggressions happening all the time. For example, in my legal career, there were at least 30 times that someone said to me, "You don't look like a lawyer." Right? That's a microaggression. It stems from a bias that's ingrained in our legal profession that lawyers need to look a certain way. Right? There were times when I went to court where I was mistaken for the paralegal, right, or the secretary, and the judge would say, "Let us know when the attorney on record gets here," and I'm like, "I'm here." Right? So I would see things like this, but there was really nothing that you could do about it because there was no law on the issue, there were no policies, there were no practices in place. Right? And so it really was the reason why I started my company. Now I want to make a few points on this uncivil behavior spectrum. Incivility is viewed at from the eyes of the recipient. I hear this all the time, people saying, "Well, that wasn't my intention. When I made that joke, my intention was to be funny. I wasn't trying to harm that person." Right? Well, here's the thing, the law doesn't care about your intention. What we care about is the harm that's happening. So we look at it, especially when we look at it from the perspective of a work environment. Right? If we want to create a civil workplace or a workplace of respect and dignity, we have to eliminate the harmful behavior that might be happening in the workplace. right? So we're not really concerned about the intention of the person, we're really concerned about the harm that happens. And here's why that's important. Because if I make a joke, and for me it's normal, for me it's appropriate, but somebody else from a different culture might take that differently. Here's a perfect example of a case that I worked on early on. I had a case where an employee filed a complaint against another coworker, and she claimed that she was feeling uncomfortable because he was standing too close to her. And this made her feel uncomfortable. Everywhere she would go, he would be right there standing next to her. And pretty soon she got uncomfortable with it. So as a workplace investigator, I know there's always two sides to every story. So when I went and talked to him, he told me something I didn't know before. He said that he was just trying to be respectful because he was Japanese, and his culture, and the way that he was raised, if you stand more than 2 feet away from somebody, you're actually being disrespectful. That's an example of how one person might engage in behavior that's okay and normal for them, but it might be making somebody else feel uncomfortable. Now, we were able to get in and coach the 2 employees and work with them, and they still work together to this day. But I saw cases like this happening as an employment lawyer all the time, where we had issues like this where the behavior wasn't properly addressed. And so the behavior continued, and pretty soon it became a sexual harassment complaint, or it became an intentional discrimination complaint. So when I started practicing employment law here, I thought I was going to run into all these bad supervisors or malicious or, engaging with this horrible behavior. And what I actually saw was people that were well-intentioned, that were really trying to do their best, but they were engaging in behaviors that they thought were okay, or they were engaging in behaviors because of their hidden biases that they weren't aware of, and nobody talked to them about this behavior, so they continued engaging in that behavior until it looked intentional, and now we're in court. So what I want to highlight for everybody here is that when we look at this uncivil behavior spectrum, the goal is to disrupt the behavior when it starts to happen in a respectful, civil way, so it doesn't continue to progress until it ends up being illegal behavior. So here's an example that I share a lot, which I think will resonate with all of you. Again, a lot of times this uncivil behavior happens with people that are good people, that are well-intentioned. So imagine you have a supervisor maybe has a couple of employees that are not performing their job well. And so to get them in line, or to get them to meet their numbers, the supervisor or law partner occasionally yells at those 2 employees to get them to do their work. Again, good intentions. Now, if I got involved early on and was called into that situation, we would put that supervisor on notice in a respectful way to say, hey, this behavior is making these 2 employees feel uncomfortable, or is making them feel offended. Please don't do that behavior again. That's what we want to do, right? We want to coach our supervisors. We want to coach people. We want to put them on notice in a respectful way. So if we would have done that back at the very beginning, now the supervisor is on notice and is accountable for their own behavior. But if we don't do that, which is what happens in a majority of cases, what's going to happen? The supervisor is going to continue to engage in that behavior over and over again, and pretty soon it becomes the normal way of doing things around here. And now you're a doorway away from a toxic work, right? So as an employment law attorney, when I saw this happening over and over again, that behaviors get worse over time. They never go away until we put that person on notice in the right way. So then the issue became, well, why is it my responsibility to put somebody on notice? What if I'm not the one that's being impacted by the behavior? Is it still my responsibility to put that person on notice? So then I started looking at training programs, and I started looking at what employers were doing to help employees or their workers know what to say, what to do in those situations. And there was nothing. The anti-harassment training that was being offered once every 2 years back then Now it's required for managers once a year and non-managers once every 2 years. All that tells you is to punt it over to HR and let HR or tell your manager and have them deal with it. But what about empowering people so they know what to do in these situations? And so I saw a lot of things missing, and that's some of the things I want to talk to you about today, is what do you do in these situations if you as legal professionals who are carrying the torch, in my opinion, for advocating for civility, what should you be doing in these situations? And so I'll give you some ideas on how you can intervene. And so before I give you some strategies, let's talk about why this conversation is so important right now. Again, like I said, I knew I wanted to deal with it when I started in 2017, but now the world has changed so much since then, right? So some of the root causes, I think it's important to understand the root causes of why we see incivility in the legal profession and in the world, why it has skyrocketed. One of the things is stress and burnout, right? It's no surprise that lawyers are overworked, where we're having to deal with judges and juries and client problems and everything has to happen right now. That stress, that burnout shows up in how we interact with each other, especially when you're now interacting more frequently in the computer, right? On Zoom video conferences all day. People say and do things a lot when they're under stress and when they're close to burnout. Incivility rears its ugly head way more often, right? Then you've got stereotypes and bias. This was the other thing that I found when I started doing this work, is that most people lacked awareness on how unconscious bias really works and what it is and how to understand what it is and how to mitigate it. And so it was really frustrating to me as an attorney that I didn't learn about unconscious bias until way later into my practice. And I couldn't believe that this wasn't something that we were being taught in law school, in undergrad. This is a topic that we're hearing more about. In fact, I think there's a session after this of somebody talking on implicit bias, and now we're required as attorneys to have some implicit bias. But back when I was practicing, that wasn't the case. And so it was an area that I said, if people don't even understand what unconscious bias is, and that it's normal, and I'll talk to you a little bit more about how you can identify your own unconscious bias. But I wanted to share a resource with all of you, because when we have our hidden biases, and we're not aware of what they are, and we don't know how to de-bias our practice of law, this is going to impact how we interact with one another. And it wasn't until I had one of my first cases that I was practicing that I realized that I had a lot of work to do with my own biases. So, as Audrey mentioned during my intro, I'm Indian, but I was born here. But my parents came from India, they had that Indian accent. So when I grew up, I dealt with a lot of harassment and bullying. And so one of the first cases I worked on was an Indian woman, and she was claiming that she was harassed by one of her white male coworkers. And I'm sitting across from this woman, and if you just knew my story, the little that you know about my story right now, you would probably think, Sejal, you would side with that Indian woman in that case. You would naturally tend to have a favorable opinion of her because you were harassed. Now she's claiming harassment, she's Indian, you're Indian. You're naturally going to tend to favor her. And that might have been true, except the minute she opened her mouth, she had an Indian accent. And I had a negative bias towards Indian accents. And the reason for that was because I was harassed and bullied from my parents' Indian accents. So I had internalized a negative bias against Indian accents, and I didn't realize it until I was sitting across from this woman. And I felt a strong negative reaction towards her. And that's when I realized, wait a second, I've got a lot of work to do here, because how can I represent her or anybody if I've got these types of biases, right? So having these negative biases or positive biases that are hidden from us is normal. And I'll talk to you a little bit more about that. And so let me just quickly go through some other reasons why this conversation is so important. Since then, we've seen incivility skyrocket. the global pandemic, right? The worldwide crisis sent us dealing with issues we've never dealt with, right? We had all these people that were now dealing with loss of their family members, of close people that they were close to. They were dealing, a lot of people were isolated for a lot of different reasons. We were dealing with issues like, should we wear a mask? Should we require people to get their, the shots? Should we not? And what we saw was people got triggered. A lot of people felt there was a loss of control. They didn't have a voice in what was going on. And that led to a huge rise in confrontation and civility. And we still don't know what the true effects from COVID are. But what we do know is that there is still a lot of people who think that COVID's over, which it isn't. 60% of a lot of hospitals are still filled with COVID patients, right? So people are still feeling that loss of control, and again, contributing to the rise of incivility, especially in workplaces. The civil rights movement, even prior to the civil rights movement, we can't have a conversation about civility without recognizing the systemic problems that persist in this country, right? So what the civil rights movement did was it brought up a lot of fear, a lot of bias that was always there, but it brought it up to the front. And now we saw a huge increase in incivility, just in the Bay Area. You heard about a lot of the Asian hate crimes happening. You heard about all this incivility happening that was happening already, but it just came to the forefront, right? And so we can't ignore the incivility and then globalization. I wanted to just share this statistic with you because when I read this, it really made me realize that we have to do something about this now before it's too late. So globalization, what all of a sudden now when you've got thousands of people working from home, I have clients that yesterday I taught a client that was in South Africa. Last week I had a client in India. So now you've got globalization where you're coming into contact with people of all different religions, all different cultures, and that's caused a huge increase in incivility. So I wanted to share this one statistic with you. Pew's Research Center said that in the next 25 years, there are going to be 4 billion people working together. Over 4,200 different religions, 5,000 different cultural ethnicities, and 6,000 languages. So when you've got all these people from different cultures, different religions, different languages coming together, and people don't know how to interact with one another, or they're not comfortable with the differences that you're going to deal with when you're dealing with that kind of diversity, if we don't manage those sort of differences properly, it can quickly turn into conflict. And then you've got multi-generational workforces. I'm getting calls from clients where there's 5 different generations that are working together. So I'm already getting calls saying, we've got a senior level manager who's having problems with this entry level manager because they're not on the same page as far as how to communicate or how to use technology, right? So that's creating a lot of incivility in workplaces as well. And then the last thing here is remote working technology. Again, when you've got so many people spending hours, they say that an average professional is spending 6 hours a day on email. That's not even including browsing the net, shopping, doing whatever else you do. This is strictly on email. And so people have lost sight of how to communicate face-to-face, how to interact face-to-face, right? And so when we think about for example, when you think about workplace bullies, we think about somebody that's right there in front of you. But with the increase in remote working technology, cyberbullying has increased tenfold, right? And so sometimes I still look at employers' policies, and I look at their employment policies, and I'm like, there is nothing in here about cyberbullying. People, what do you do when someone makes inappropriate comments to you on Slack or during a video conference? And there's nothing in these policies, right? So we need to be proactive in how we deal with this. And so why is civility the solution? So I wanted to share with you this statistic. When I read this statistic, this alone was the reason why I chose to, this was a major reason why I chose to focus on civility as the area that I wanted to really shed light on and empower people. Christine Porath is a civility expert, and she travels the world advising organizations on civility, just like I do. But she's a professor of management at Georgetown University, and this study that I'm quoting these statistics from are from 2016. So based on everything that I've just shared with you, these numbers have increased significantly. But in 2016, 95% of people said that they believed we already had a civility problem. 70% said it had reached crisis mode. 66% said they were cutting back their work efforts because of incivility in their work environments. 80% lost time worrying about what had happened, and 2% had left their jobs. And one thing that she also noted was that incivility significantly impacted people that were witnessing what was going on. So even if it wasn't happening to them directly, it was having an impact on those in their work environments. So again, these numbers get even scarier when we start looking at the practice of law and how it's impacting all of us, right? So I want to just share some more statistics with you. American Bar Association reported that 60% of legal professionals said that when they were engaging with other people that were uncivil, whether it was opposing counsel, whether it was a judge, whether it was a legal secretary, a paralegal, it was impacting their ability to adequately represent their clients. 60%. The American Bar Association said that 65% of legal professionals reported that they had witnessed incivility. And the Journal of Applied Psychology said that lawyers or legal professionals reported decreased job satisfaction, and 48% were nearly close to leaving their jobs because of incivility they were experiencing in their law firms. Okay? And so I could just go on and on about the stress, the depression, the mental health issues that lawyers report because of incivility that they're dealing with opposing counsel from judges. Right, so again, I could spend the next hour just sharing statistics with you, but rather than do that, I want to jump into giving you some strategies that you can start to implement. So before I give the strategies, let's all get on the same page as to what do we mean by civility, right? And so if I had more time, I would go around and ask people, this is what I do in my workshops, how do you define what civility is? And civility could mean a lot of different things to different people, right? So first thing what I want to do is get everybody on the same page. And here's the definition of civility that I use in all of my workshops in public speaking, is one by Dr. Cynthia Clark, who's a world-renowned expert in this area. And I love this because she breaks it down into different elements. And as attorneys, I know we resonate on different elements of how we practice, right? So what she first says is, this is what a lot of people assume, that civility is the same thing as respect. And it's more than that. Civility includes respect, right? We have to have respect for one another, but she also adds on these 3 other bullet points, which I really think are important and show you the difference between respect and civility. So civility, in the way she says it, yes, of course it includes respect. We have to value and affirm each other's worth as individuals, right? Deserving the same dignity and respect that we want for ourselves. So that's a component of civility. But she also says that it requires time, and it requires for us to be present. And so what that means is, we're part of this hustle culture. It's all about go, 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 especially lawyers. We've got 100 things to do before we even leave a meeting. But what I'm telling you and what I'm advocating is that when we're in those situations where we're dealing uncivil behavior, we have to stop, we have to make time to be present, to address that situation with that person, with the willingness to engage in genuine discourse to reach that shared common ground, which really flies in the face of everything that lawyers are taught to do, right? We have to come together and make time to address those behaviors. As I said before, if we don't address those behaviors, they just continue and fester until they get worse. So I love this definition because what it does is it makes us all accountable for the situations that we're dealing with. And so when we think about it from this perspective, how we treat each other and our actions really are going to be a huge indicator of whether we have a culture of civility in the environments that we're working in. So that really makes you a part of the solution, right? So if you see uncivil behavior, you need to do something about it. And I'm going to tell you how you can speak up in those situations. So let's be honest. When you're engaging with people that are different from you, and the way that I look at diversity is we're all different from each other. The word diversity has a negative bias. Just even saying that word, people go, oh, not a diversity conversation, right? And so the first thing I want to do is expand your definition of diversity. I think a lot of times people think of diversity as, race, color, religion, national origin, and of course those are all very important layers of diversity. But if you look at this slide right here, and all of you have access, you'll get a copy of all of my slides. The point on this slide is there are so many different layers of diversity, beginning with our core personality, right? Then you have all these primary layers, you have your organizational layers of diversity. We're all different from each other, right? And so when you're dealing with people that are different than you, it's going to create certain challenges. No matter what organization, no matter what environment you're in, it's going to take more time to reach consensus. It's going to take more effort to get everybody on the same page. You're going to deal with unfamiliarity when you're dealing with someone, that speaks a different language. You're going to have cultural issues, communication issues, how we resolve conflict may be different depending on who you're talking to. So when you've got diversity, you're going to have these inherent challenges that you need to work through. And that's where incivility really starts to come out. And so whenever I do these workshops for organizations, I always tell them that, look, this is normal. You're going to have conflict in your organization. But if we handle that conflict the right way, conflict can actually be productive in certain situations. It can lead to innovation, right? It can lead to thinking that's outside of the box if we create that psychological safety. And that's why interrupting these behaviors early on is really the key to creating cultures of civility. So I went through the challenges. So the question I always ask leaders is, when you've got people that are different than us and we're dealing with these challenges, what is your civility action plan? And when I ask that question, people just usually look at me and they're like, what are you talking about? Civility action plan? I don't even know what that really means. We have a diversity and inclusion action plan. We do our anti-harassment trainings, but we don't really include civility in a lot of that stuff, right? And so I want to give you some things to think about. What I'm sharing with you are just some quick tips on things to consider if you have an organization, a law firm, what you can include in your practice of law. But even if it's just for yourself, to think about how you can incorporate civility into your own lives with the interactions that you're having with the people that you're interacting with. These are some things that you want to start thinking about, right? What kind of definition are you giving to civility? What kind of expectations? You can't assume people know what is appropriate behavior, what is inappropriate behavior. I've had so many leaders that I work with, and they're like, we feel like we're telling little children how to behave. Do we really need to do that? Do we need to give specific situations or examples? And my answer is yes. Because what you may view as appropriate may not be the same thing as somebody on your team views as appropriate. So you need to be very clear on what is appropriate, what is not appropriate. And once you're clear about it, you need to communicate that to everybody on your team. Right? The other thing is, what kind of education and training are you offering to people? Right? Having a one-off training once a year is not enough. This is something that you want to keep coming back to. So in your training plan, you want to consider things like conflict resolution, cultural competence, how we communicate effectively, how do we understand what our hidden biases are. So there's a lot of different topics, including diversity and inclusion, that you want to think about incorporating into your civility action plan. And again, it's not a one-time thing. This has to be an ongoing process, right? The other thing that I tell leaders, look, are you leading by example? Are you leading by example? People, especially as legal leaders, you have to be the role models and how you interact with your co-counsel or opposing counsel or the judge. People need to look at you to see as a model. Are you demonstrating civility in your own actions? Are you encouraging open communication? So people can voice their opinions openly, even if they're different than yours. Look, if we want to address pressing issues like climate change or political polarization or the social inequities that we're dealing with in our current world, we have to create those spaces where people can have that civil discourse. That's the only way you can get to effective problem solving. So are you creating those spaces where people can voice their opinions and disagree with you? Right? If people know that you strongly lean on one side of the debate, they may not be so comfortable in voicing that opinion unless you're creating that psychological safety. So are you asking for feedback from your teams? Do you feel safe in voicing your opinions, or even if it's new ideas? If your teams and the people that you're interacting with are not feeling safe, that's not going to help you foster civility. Are you offering coaching or mentoring to maybe people that you're dealing with that are subordinate to you? Right? Or what kind of coaching are you offering to people that are superior than you? Managing up is another key component. A lot of times I've been getting so many calls from people on, I have a supervisor or our senior law partner is engaging in uncivil behaviors and I don't know how to handle it. How do I manage up? And I'll give you a couple tips on how you can do that. And then the other thing is, how are you supporting the well-being of your team, right? People that you're interacting with. I see this happening in law firms all the time. Associates, paralegals, your legal secretaries. Are you checking in with them on whether they need support on dealing with these situations? And then are you employing external resources to help you? Because sometimes I'll hear leaders say, we have an open door policy, they can come to me at any time. But maybe they don't feel comfortable coming to you. Are there other avenues for them to be able to speak up? Are you offering anonymous feedback surveys? Now people are using technology. So you have to be comprehensive in your action plan so that you can really get it ingrained into the workplaces or the cultures that you're working with. So let's get a little bit more specific on this topic. So I've just given you some general tips on things for you to consider, because sometimes what I hear is we do X, Y, and Z, and I'm like, that's not holistic enough. You want to really take a more broader approach, a more detailed approach. But now let's talk about all of you. What are some things that you can start doing within yourself to make sure that you're careful about how you're acting, what you're saying, what you're not saying, maybe you're communicating through your body language that might be sending the wrong message, even if you don't intend for it to do so. So it starts with this conversation around bias. And I know we're not here to talk about unconscious bias. I know there's another presentation afterwards. But I do think there's certain things that I do want to share with you that will help you get started on this journey. First thing is that we're all susceptible to bias. Right? And this was a huge part of my legal journey. When I learned about unconscious bias, it was something that you can't unlearn. Right? And so the first thing I want to tell everybody is that bias could be conscious or it could be unconscious. And bias could also be positive or negative. A lot of people think when we say bias, they automatically assume we're talking about negative bias. But it could be a favorable bias. So I have a son who's 11, and he's the center of my universe. Now, if I saw somebody walking down the street, or if I had a client come in that looked like my son, it's natural that I might feel more favorable towards that person because they remind me of someone that I love. Because they remind me of someone that I love, right? So that's an example of a positive bias. And so bias could be positive or negative, right? And it could be conscious or unconscious. So I'm not going to take up your time talking to you about conscious bias, because we know that we need to deal with that separately. But let's talk about unconscious bias. what is unconscious bias and how does it work? So there's been so much research done in the last decade that's helped us to understand how our brain works. Research shows that our brain processes close to 11 million pieces of information every single second. That's a lot of information. And so how much of that information do you think we consciously process? Only 50 pieces of information. So that means the rest of that 11 million pieces of information is being processed unconsciously by our brains. Okay? So what happens is our brain engages in a complex pattern recognition. And so without us even knowing it, it's creating all of these shortcuts. And just like how I did when I was sitting across from that Indian woman in that lawsuit, it creates these shortcuts and we don't even know about it until we're faced with that specific situation. And so, where does our unconscious bias come from? Well, partly it's because of the hardwiring. But partly it's because of our lived experiences. And we've all had different lived experiences. We've been exposed to different cultures, different religions, different lived experiences altogether. So my hidden biases are going to be totally different than the person sitting next to me. And the scary part, when you start to do this work to really understand what your hidden biases are, what you see is that your hidden biases a lot of the times are exactly the opposite than what you currently believe. Because we evolved, but those shortcuts that are there in our brains are still there. So here I am, a person that's out there advocating for diversity and inclusion, and yet I'm sitting across from somebody with a hidden bias against their negative accent, about their Indian accent, right? That's contrary to my current belief. I want everybody to be treated with dignity and respect, and yet I've got this negative bias. And that's what you start to learn, is a lot of our hidden biases are exactly the opposite of what we currently believe, and that's where it gets scary. So that means if you're not aware of your hidden biases, you might be saying and doing things without even knowing it, unintentionally, that might be harming the people around you. And that's what we call it, is microaggressions. And so some of you might have heard about that Starbucks incident that happened a few years ago, where they had two African-American men in a Starbucks, right? And that's where we first started to hear this conversation about unconscious bias. That's when I was learning about it for the first time. And when I heard about what had happened and started actually digging in, these two gentlemen were just there as customers, waiting for somebody else to show up, and they were arrested. And after that incident, Starbucks closed down they closed down all of their stores and trained 175,000 employees on implicit bias and unconscious bias. And so what you see on this slide is an example of how our hidden biases or our lived experiences we might be looking at the same exact thing and we might be interpreting it differently. Okay? And so I wanted to share with you, because it's normal to have your unconscious bias, I wanted to give you 3 tools that you can start using today to help you recognize what your own unconscious biases are, so that you're not doing things unintentionally that might be harming those around you. Because here's the thing that happens, is sometimes these biases give unearned advantages to some people, and they give unearned disadvantages to other people. And so as lawyers, you're making all kinds of important decisions. Do I take this case? Do I represent this client? When you're deposing somebody, when you're picking a jury, you're making lots of important decisions that impact people's lives. And so if you're not aware of your own unconscious biases, you might be making decisions based on your hidden biases that might be detrimental to others, right? So it's very important that you do this work. So like I said, we're basically an autopilot, right? How would you feel if you were on an airplane and the pilot all of a sudden makes an announcement and says, all right, everybody, I'm going to put this thing on cruise control and I'm going to take a little nap. That's what we're doing every single day. We are on autopilot. We think we're intentional and deliberate in the ways that we carry ourselves, but what we realize is that our conscious, deliberate thinking is a very small part of our decision making. It's actually really scary, right? So again, I wanted to give you 3 tools that'll help you start uncovering your own unconscious biases. The first tool is simple. Increase your self-awareness. Start paying attention to those moments when you see somebody for the first time and you notice that you have a strong positive or negative reaction towards this person that you just met. Just start paying attention to those situations. When you start doing this work, you figure out your inner roommate is pretty noisy and it makes a lot of assumptions about people. It's pretty scary, actually. But it's not just their negative reactions, positive ones too, right? So ask yourself in those situations when you have that strong reaction to somebody, why? Why am I having this strong negative or positive reaction for this person that I just met, right? And ask yourselves these things. So I just gave you some questions because here's the thing. We make a lot of assumptions about people for all the things that are listed on here because we have different families, different preferences, different experiences. And so we do this, but we don't stop enough to really think about how subjective our assumptions are, rather than based on what is right there in front of us. Right? We don't make time to think about those, how subjective they are. So let's say, for example, you're working with somebody, you're interacting with somebody. You can ask yourself questions like, are you giving somebody benefit of the doubt or making excuses for that person because they have a shared trait that you do? Let's say you're hiring for a position at your firm or your practice, and someone walks in and they've gone to the same university as you. Are you going to view them as more favorable because they went to the same university that you did or the same law school as you did? You might. And there's nothing wrong with feeling that way, right? It only makes a difference when you hire that person versus somebody else who maybe had better qualifications because you hired them because they went to the same school as you, right? So ask yourself, what are my reasons for making this decision? Ask yourself, am I automatically siding with somebody because of a similar characteristic? Because they look like me? Because they talk like me? Because they remind me of me? That's called affinity bias. Ask yourself, am I holding somebody else to different standards because of the way that, because they were raised like me? Because they're the same religion as me? We don't stop to really think about why we're making these decisions. Ask yourself, would I be making the same conclusions about this person if they were of a different profile? If they were a man instead of a woman? If they were of a different sexual preference? If they were of a different religion? Okay? When you start doing this work, what you learn is scientists have recognized that there's over 180 different kinds of cognitive shortcuts our brain takes when we're making these important decisions. 180. And so you start noticing patterns in the decisions that you're making. And so the only way you can stop making those, break those patterns is by doing the work to learn what your unconscious biases are. So the first thing again is self-awareness. Right? The second tool is an online tool. It's called the implicit association test. Okay? It was a tool, I don't like calling it a test. Right? It's not a pass or fail, but it's a tool. It's a self-awareness tool. It was put together with a collaboration of psychologists from Harvard, from University of Virginia, University of Washington, and they came together and they created this tool. And it's broken out into different categories. Last I checked, there were 14 different sections to this test. Don't do them all at the same time, they'll give you a big head, right? You want to break it up. I like to say, make a date with yourself, a self-awareness date, every 2 weeks, and sit down and do a section of that test. See what you learn about yourself. And I took that test, and I learned so much about my biases. I had no idea. I'll just share one example. So, I took a version of the test, and it asked these 4 questions. It asked me, if you had a girl, would you feel comfortable dressing your girl in all pink? I didn't hesitate, I said yes. If you had a girl, would you feel comfortable dressing your girl in all blue? No hesitation. And then it switched it. If you had a boy, and I just told you all that I have a boy, would you feel comfortable dressing your boy in all blue? No hesitation. And then came that last question. If you had a boy, would you feel comfortable dressing in all pink? And it made me stop. I had to think about that question. That's evidence of hidden bias. Now, somewhere along the way, somebody put it here that boys shouldn't be wearing pink. Does that make me a bad person? No. And you're thinking, why does it matter? Why is she sharing this story with us? Because what if I was hiring and a gentleman walked in with a pink shirt and I didn't know about that hidden bias, which I didn't before I took that test? Who's to say I would not have hired him because of that shirt that he was wearing? That's how much these biases can impact our decision making. But now that I know about that, and a gentleman walks in with a pink shirt, I can check that bias at the door and say, hey, wait a second. Don't make this decision based on the color of the shirt. Look at the skills and the characteristics. I mean, in the experience that this person brings in making your decision. That's the thing. The hidden biases are not harmful until you act on them. Right? But now I know about that so I can make better decisions. And that's really what that tool is designed to do. So I took that tool years ago when I started learning about this. And then I went back and recently took it again, and I had more work to do to learn more about my biases, right? That's the thing. This is an ongoing process. It's a lifelong journey. Right? So take the tool, because all it can do is help you understand where your natural tendencies are. Right? It doesn't mean you're a bad person. That just means because of what you've been exposed to, you lean in this direction. So now you can be aware of that, so when you need to be objective, you can be in your interactions with other people. The other tool, the third tool that I want to share with you, is very, very simple. Biases, the thing about unconscious bias is that they're hidden from us. We don't know what they are until we do the work. But here's the thing, it comes out in our behaviors, our actions, the things that we say and we do. The people that you love, that you care about, that you spend a lot of time with, they know what your biases are. So ask somebody that you trust, and say, hey, and I'm not talking about the person that's going to tell you what you want to hear. That doesn't help us grow. Right? I'm talking about ask the person that's going to be brutally honest with you. And say, hey, when I make important decisions, do you think I have any kind of bias? You might want to have a glass of wine or two before you have that conversation, because they'll tell you. And it, because they know. It comes out in our behaviors, right? So those are 3 tools that help you understand your unconscious bias. And why that's important in the civility conversation is, again, hidden biases, if you're not aware of them, can result in behaviors and actions that you're not intending. They're happening unintentionally that can be harming other people. And those are called microaggressions. And And microaggressions are uncivil behavior. And so if I just go back to that slide again real quickly just to make this point, is that when you look at that slide of the uncivil behavior spectrum, microaggressions fall in that green area of behaviors of concern. Now, we don't have anything in the law about microaggressions, but microaggressions happen daily, frequently, towards people of marginalized groups. So if people are engaging in microaggressions on a daily basis, and it's happening frequently, the impact of those negative behaviors can be even more significant than your illegal behaviors that don't happen as often, right? And so it creates a lot of incivility in organizations. And so that's a whole other conversation of what microaggressions are and how bad they can, how harmful they can be. But just for the context of this discussion, to know that if we don't do the work to understand our own unconscious biases, we're contributing to the incivility that's happening all around us, right? So again, we need to be part of the solution. So doing the work on unconscious bias is going to help you root out your biases so that you can make sure you're not engaging in microaggressions that happen by well-intentioned people. The next thing I'm going to talk to you about is how we have conversations. Right? That's another huge part of it. As lawyers, we're having a lot of difficult conversations. We're having conversations with judges, with everybody. And so some of these conversations can lead to incivility. Right? So the first thing I wanted to do is to really kind of share with you what makes some of our conversations as attorneys that we're dealing with, what makes them difficult, and why are we seeing so much incivility in these conversations. You know, I remember this conversation when I was waiting to pass my bar in California. I started doing unemployment law hearings. So you can be a hearing representative and not be licensed. And so that's what I did at the very beginning. Now, keep in mind, this was in 2002, right? So I got licensed in 2003. This was a long time ago. The dynamics of the group of people I was dealing with were basically white men, was what I was dealing with, right? So I dealt with a lot of microaggressions in that moment, but I had a lot of difficult conversations in that moment. So here's the list I came up with, 5 things that make these conversations difficult and create more incivility, right? One is that there's oftentimes disparities in privilege and power, right? At the time I was dealing with workers' compensation judges, right? And so we have to acknowledge that there are differences in privileges and there's differences in power. And these create imbalances. And for some people that creates advantages, and for some people that creates disadvantages. And that can create incivility in conversations. I remember a workers' compensation judge literally shutting me down and not even giving me an opportunity to argue my case. Even though the laws had just changed, that's when the workers' compensation system went through that major rehaul, for those of you that are familiar with that system. So I was on the same footing as everybody else in that moment. Even if you've been practicing workers' comp for years, you had to learn the new law that was out there, the new standards. And I was trying to argue my case and the judge basically shut me down. And he used his privilege and power to not let me advocate for my client in that case. That made that conversation very difficult, right? The other thing that makes these conversations very difficult is emotions when we're dealing with clients or opposing counsel. Emotions are strong and sometimes very difficult to manage, especially when you've got people that are passionate about their case, right? Or they're really trying to advocate for their client. When we have high emotions, it impacts our ability to think logically, to be rational. And so then you have feelings of resentment. You start seeing that passive-aggressive type behavior, sarcasm, belittling, impatience, right? A lot of incivility. I had an opposing counsel come up to me after we did a 2-week trial. I was representing the San Francisco Zoo in an employment law case. I was second chair on that case. After 2 weeks, we got a defense verdict. And I remember opposing counsel coming up to me in the hallway as I was standing outside, and I think he was trying to make me feel bad or put me down. And he literally came right to my face and he said, you don't have to argue like that in the courtroom. As if I had done something wrong when I was representing my client. He was obviously very emotional, right? But the way that he talked to me with the tone, the sarcasm, that was uncivil behavior. And we see that happening all the time with how we interact with opposing counsel. Then the third thing is I feel like, especially in the practice of law, there's a lot of assumptions that are being made about the other person's out to harm you. So we always assume that this other person's intention is negative. And so it's typical to focus on who do we blame, who do we point the finger at, rather than trying to solve the problem. So in the practice of laws, we see a lot of that finger pointing and blaming going on, rather than trying to address the root cause of the issue. The other thing I think in the practice of law that makes conversations difficult and creates incivility is there's uncertainty about the outcome that the case is going to lead to. Right? We don't know which way the jury is going to land, but that uncertainty complicates the situation. And oftentimes, because of that uncertainty or that fear, it creates more incivility in how we interact with one another. And the last one is just differing life experiences. All of us are attorneys. We probably have different areas that we practice in. And because we might have opposing views on certain issues, because of the nature of what we do, we see a lot more incivility when we're having these conversations, right? So when we're dealing with these types of conversations, and we all face them, regardless of what area of law you deal with, whether you're a manager or not. These are just some examples of some of the types of conversations that we see. But I think it's important when we're trying to manage these conversations to reduce or minimize the incivility, because the reality is we can't eliminate difficult conversations. But what we can do is reduce the stress. So here's something I want you to keep in mind when you're having these difficult conversations, right? Keep in mind that when you're having, let's say you're talking to opposing counsel, you have 3 different conversations that you're managing at the same time, right? The first one is the what's happened conversation. Here's where people start to disagree on what actually happened versus what should have happened. This is where one person says, I'm right and you're wrong. And that leads to arguing and debating, right? And this is where most of the time is spent, is trying to get through who's right, who's wrong, right? Who's to blame, who did their part, and this is where people start to get locked in to their position, right? And you see this happening a lot with lawyers, and I see it happening day and night. And so a lot of people spend the majority of their time in the what's happened part of the conversation. But what I want to really highlight for you are these other 2 aspects, which I think lawyers don't really think about as much. The second one is the feelings conversation, right? This is where we have to realize that a lot of people struggle with expressing their feelings or even understanding their feelings, right? When you're dealing with topics that are, I was an employment law attorney practicing, so there were certain cases like sexual harassment that I was really passionate about. So it would bring up a lot of strong feelings. So when I was dealing with opposing counsel that was, being uncivil towards me, I had a hard time being vulnerable or expressing the feelings that this conversation was bringing up for me, right? And I think for attorneys, the 2 things that are the hardest for us is to recognize that first we have feelings and that we express those feelings in those conversations, but also that we have to listen to each other when we're expressing these feelings. And so this is something I want you to keep in mind, that when you get into these debates that are happening in the practice, in our practices, that what are the feelings that are underlying what this person is saying? What is the cause of those feelings? And then the third one is the identity conversation. A lot of times these conversations get uncivil because we're afraid about how is this person going to view me after this conversation is open? Are they going to judge me? Is this going to impact the sense of who I am? Will it expose my vulnerabilities, my self-doubts? How's the firm going to see me? How's the judge going to see me? And so what I learned when I started doing this work is that most attorneys get stuck on the what's happened part of the conversation, and they don't really manage the feelings and the identity part of the conversation. And once you learn to manage those, you can really get this back into a dialogue scenario versus what we end up a lot of the time is a debate. So when you get caught on the what's happened part of the conversation, you're really stuck in that debate side of this, of the left side of the slide here, where now you're just really, it's all about who's winning, it's adversarial, right? But it's not really getting to that dialogue, which is if we want to have civil discourse, we have to manage all three parts of the conversation to bring it back into the dialogue part of the conversation where you can kind of see the big picture and you can get to a mutually agreed resolution. That doesn't mean everyone's going to love the resolution, but you can get to there once you get to the dialogue space. And so come back and take a look at this slide later on, but really this is where I think we can really minimize incivility during this conversation. And on this next slide, I can spend an hour on, and I literally do in some of my workshops, right? This speech, how we communicate with each other in the practice of law of, do we really think about what we're saying before we say it? Now that sounds a lot easier than it is. Of course, we like to say we do. But if you look at the slide, there is so much that you have to consider as a lawyer, as a legal representative, before you actually say the words. So you're talking to opposing counsel, and they trigger you, or they say something that's making you feel uncomfortable. Look at all the different filters that I'm suggesting you go through before your words actually come out, whether it's verbally, whether it's written, right? You want to think about it. Am I using my judgment? Do these words need filtering? We're at a different time right now. We're redefining words, right? We're getting rid of some words, we're putting in new words. We have to be careful of the words we use. They do matter. So, am I using the right words? Do I need to filter the words with the person that I'm talking to, right? And then intention. What is my intention for saying this comment or for reacting this way? Am I saying it to hurt the other person? When that attorney came up to me in the hallway, he was saying what he was saying to hurt me in some way, right? He was trying to scare me. He was trying to bully me. The third thing is choice. To recognize that we do have a choice in how we react to the person, even if they're triggering us. And we don't have to. I got into the habit of putting myself on a timeout, 24 hours. When I get triggered, I know it now. I've done this work long enough that I put myself on a 24-hour timeout. Why is it that we put kids on timeouts? Because our emotional mind reacts a lot quicker than our rational mind. So we want to give that person time to think and let that emotional mind calm down so we can act rationally, right? So knowing that you have a choice. And then compassion. How can I understand the other person's perspective? Can I try to see it from their side, their shoes, right? Empathy. I really think that empathy is a skill that a lot of attorneys lack. To be able to try to see and understand the other person's perspective, even if you don't agree with it. And then, did I listen properly to what the person was saying? Active listening is another skill. Listening to understand, not just listening to listen, right? And so here's a little trick. I always tell myself, my brain, because your brain can only do one thing at a time. It can listen or it can think. So if you're already thinking about, what kind of drink I'm going to have at the happy hour, I lost you. Maybe you're not listening anymore. So whenever I'm getting into a situation where I know it might get heated, or it's going to be a situation where I really need to be prepared and I need to listen to the conversation, I remind my brain one thing: paraphrase. You have to paraphrase what this person is telling you back to them. Because you can't paraphrase back to something to somebody unless you actually listen to them. So just gently remind yourself to paraphrase. And then you kick your brain into listening mode. And then, will this embarrass this person? And are my words respectful? There's so much on the slide that if you run the situation you're on and your immediate reaction through the slide, you can really mitigate the incivility in that conversation. So then, but there's times where you're not going to see eye to eye, right? That's just a part of what we do as lawyers. We're not going to see eye to eye all the time, but we still have to be civil in those situations. And so here are just some quick tips, and I know a lot of you already know these, but it's worth reinforcing. It's the first one is so important, is to focus on the issue at hand. It's not about personally attacking that person. It's easy to take things personally when we get so hung up on our own views, but really focusing on the issue at hand. I told a supervisor just 2 days ago, because he wanted to manage one of his team members' performance. And I said, okay, tell me what you're going to tell this employee when you go into this meeting. And he threw out the kitchen sink. Well, he did this 2 years ago, 3 years ago, and I go, wait a second. You should have dealt with that issue 3 years ago, and the other one 2 years ago. We were only having this conversation about what do we need to talk about right now? Right? Focus on the issue at hand. It's your fault if you didn't deal with that issue that happened 3 years ago. That makes you a bad leader, right? And so really when we're talking about opposing counsel, I see attorneys doing that too, where they throw out everything. And I'm like, wait a second. Focus on the issue at hand, right? And then listen actively. We just talked about that. Try to understand the different perspectives. And then express your opinions, but do it respectfully and constructively. Right? I see a lot of attorneys just being demanding and demanding certain outcomes, rather than really thinking about how are we going to resolve this disagreement and be problem solvers. Even though we're litigators or whatever kind of law you're practicing, you still need to get to a solution. And in order for that to happen, you need to be able to have civil discourse and be able to share your opinions respectfully. And then always looking for that common ground in areas of agreement. You know, I always say it's kind of like when you're crafting your negotiation strategy. You have to seek common ground. Right? And so what are those areas that you agree on? And lead with those. Right? Because I think when you start with those areas of common ground, the other person's going to be more receptive to the conversation instead of just shutting down altogether. Explore alternative solutions together. It's about problem solving. Before I started my company, I worked for UCSF Medical School, and I was doing sexual harassment investigation. That was really my job. And there were so many victims, or complainants, I should say, not victims, complainants, that would come through my door that had been claiming they were being sexually harassed. And they talked to their supervisor, they talked to the union, they talked to 3 or 4 other people before they walked in my door. So by this point, they fully believed their story. They were firm, feet were in the sand, right? And still, I was able to resolve over 90% of the cases that walked in my door. And he was literally following these steps to a T. Asking them what they wanted as a solution. Not to say I can always give them that solution, but one of the things that's really clear that I've learned, and I'm sure most of you agree this, is a lot of times when these cases come up, most people just want to be heard. They want to feel like they're a part of the solution. They were not talking down to them as lawyers, they were including them in the process. So asking them for that was my first question. Before even getting into the facts with any of these people that would walk into my door, the first question would be like, let's talk about how you'd like to see this resolved. Right off the gate, I want to know where their head's at. What is it that they want to see happen? Right? If they come in and say, I want to see this person fired, well, I know how much work I got to do to get them back to a place where we can get to that shared ground, right? So really thinking about what are the solutions, and then maintaining that collaborative mindset, even if it's with opposing counsel, even if it's with somebody that you have a strong disagreement, you could still maintain a collaborative mindset and prioritize that the point of this is to get that best outcome. So these are some strategies that you can follow. And then I wanted to just talk to you quickly, as I'm running out of time as I knew I would, is how you can all be allies. I crammed a lot into this because I just wanted to give you lots to think about. All of these slides could go on for an hour, right? But how can you be an ally? Right? I know, and I speak this from my heart, when I grew up, there were a lot of people that I thought were going to be my allies that just stood around and watched because I was being harassed and discriminated against. Right? that I thought would have been my allies, like teachers, people I considered my friends, strangers that I thought would step into these environments, into these situations and help me, but they didn't. And so it's much easier to say you're an ally than actually be one, right? So here are some ways that all of you can be better, right? And now anyone has the potential to be an ally. And I'll start out by saying that what it means to be an ally really varies from person to person. I do this for a living, right? This is my way, one way that I choose to be an ally. Some people go to rallies and they put themselves in danger to be an ally, right? So I'm not going to tell you how you do it, right? That's going to depend on the risks that you're willing to take, the responsibilities you have to prime. That's up to you. But what I am going to share with you is some of the things that you can do. And how you do it, you need to figure that out on your own. But, I always thought about this. I said, why are people not speaking up? Why are people not speaking up? Because what pissed me off so much when I would do these workplace investigations is I would go back and investigate, and I would talk to people in the workplace and ask them, did you know what was going on? So many people would say, yes, I knew what was going on. I saw him talking to her that way. I saw him harass her. I saw him bully the person. And I'm sitting there thinking, well, what did you do? What did you do when you saw this behavior happen? Right? And what I learned was that a lot of times, certain behaviors are challenging. Right? Like microaggressions. People don't even know what microaggressions really are, let alone what to do when they see it happening. It's confusing. Should I say something? Should I not say something? Right? But here's the thing. The observer role, even if it's not happening to you, the observer role is really important, right? It can help take the burden off the person that's on that receiving end. We hear this statement of angry black women. We hear that a lot. Because you have that one black woman that spoke up and now she's the angry black woman, right? So if you're an observer and you do something to speak up in the right way, in a respectful, civil way, you can take the burden off that person who's already being harmed. It really shouldn't be that person's responsibility to do anything except to take care of themselves, right? They're already being harmed. So it's not fair to then say, you educate people and you speak up. Everybody else needs to be. The bystanders, the people that are watching, are really the ones responsible for speaking up. So if you're in court and you see another attorney engaging in uncivil behavior with somebody else, it's your responsibility to do something about it, right? Now, and so what I learned was that most people want to do something. They don't know what to do, and they don't know what to say, right? And a lot of people might feel reluctant to speak up. But here's the thing, if we want to create more civility in our workplaces and our practice of law, it's important for everyone to get involved, right? It's all of our problems. It really is. It's all of our problems. And so I wanted to give you some tips on what you can do in these situations, right? Now, you could say something in the moment, right? And if you feel comfortable, you could say something in the moment. And you don't have to make a big deal out of it. Right? As attorneys, we know how to focus on the facts. We know what to focus on. It's just like if you were taking a deposition. I've done this when I would take a deposition. I would ask a question, and all of a sudden the person would start shaking their legs. I would ask them, I just asked you this question, and I see that, you're shaking your legs. Is something about that question making you feel uncomfortable? I would ask that question during my deposition. You can ask about what you observe to get that person's reaction. So if you see someone else engaging, that's an example of, if you see somebody engaging in uncivil behavior, you can talk to them about what you observed, right? And again, you don't need to make a big deal out of it. You could just say, look, if you're in the workplace, right, if you're in your law firm, you could just say something very simple like, that comment's not in line with the kind of culture we want in our law. Very simple, brief, to the point, tie it to culture, tie it to civility, right? Or you could say something like, please stop, you're making me feel uncomfortable. Right? You could say something like, it's probably not your intention, but here's how that comment came across to me. Right? So what we want to do, the goal of stepping in that moment is to put that person on notice. Because a lot of times people don't realize it that their comment could be harmful. Especially, like I said, microaggressions are unintentional, right? So the goal is just only, it's not to cancel that person, right? It's not to cancel anybody. That doesn't work. We want long-term sustainable change. And the only way that happens is if we put people on notice in the right way, in a respectful way. And if that person really didn't know, and if that person wasn't doing it to harm that person, what's that person going to do? They're going to say, oh, thank you for telling me. I mean, I don't know about any of you, but if I'm doing something to harm somebody, I want to know about it, so I don't keep doing it. I always tell people, consider it a gift when someone is calling you in, so that you don't continue to harm somebody. I just had this happen the other day. Somebody called me in my own training, and I do this for a living, right? I was talking to a group, an audience like I'm right now, and there's women and men, and I refer to everybody as you guys. Now, I can justify, oh, I'm from Chicago, I'm from the Midwest, we say you guys all the time. But she felt offended by it. She's like, well, and there's 100 reasons why I shouldn't say you guys when there's a female in the room, right? And what did I do? I practiced what I preach. And I said, I'm so sorry, I'll try not to do that again, right? It's a gift. Because my intention wasn't to offend her, but I already told you, intentions don't matter, is how she felt, right? So I did the same thing. I considered that a gift. Okay, I'm gonna try to be better about it. Sometimes it slips out. You know, we have to give grace. We're humans. We're gonna we're gonna fumble as we go through this process, right? So call it in the right way. Okay? The other thing you can do sometimes is use humor. I use humor. I know how to use humor. I know it de-escalates situations. It releases that tension sometimes. But you only use humor if you know how to use humor. Right? You don't want to use humor if you're trivializing the situation or you're sending mixed messages, right, to the person. The other thing you can do is make a comment in support of that person. Hey, you know what you said? That would offend a lot of us here. You know, and let that person know that you're being an ally. You're there for them. I even say if you're in a physical room, it might be okay if you're having a meeting to just go and stand next to that person and say, yeah, I'm here. I see what's going on. Right? You gotta let that person know that you're doing something about it. Check in with that person afterwards, right? And then you don't want to give mixed messages, right? You don't want to give impression. I hear this all the time. You know, everyone's sensitive about everything nowadays. Well, that sends a mixed message. Is it okay? Is it not okay? Right? You don't want to send mixed messages. Or I heard this one the other day. Oh, you know, we're going to call the HR police in here. HR is just doing their best to try to help the situation. Don't throw them under the bus, right? So there's things that you can do. There's strategies that you can do. I'm almost out of time, but I want to say one more thing. The other thing that's really important for us as leaders is to manage up, right? So I've been getting this call so many times now where people are saying, I'm seeing a senior partner, I'm seeing my supervisor engaging in uncivil conduct, what do I do? Right? So I'm going to give you 3 things to consider in how you interact with this person, okay? Diplomacy is your best friend, right? Again, think about it as a negotiation strategy that you're crafting. You want to aim for positive resolution through the discussion. So you want to think about finding that common ground, understanding different perspectives, and how are you going to get to that mutually beneficial outcome, right? So be diplomatic, assume best intentions. Before you go into that conversation, assume that your superior is doing the best that they can with what resources they have available, right? Now, you might know their shortcomings, and you might have a different perspective on whether they are or they're not, but framing it that way in your mind with that assumption will at least increase the likelihood of a dialogue, rather than that immediate resistance that you might get if you're going in there with just a list of concerns, right? And then the third thing is frame feedback as questions instead of just these statements, right? And so when you start framing it as your concerns as inquiries, what you do again is you bring it back into that dialogue, which is where we want to be. We create that opportunity for a positive exchange, right? So again, becoming an ally takes practice, right? But when we continue to do that all collectively, that's where we start seeing that meeting. I've given you a lot of information to think about. Sorry for talking fast, but I'm super passionate about this topic, as you can tell. So I will turn it back over to Audrey for closing comments, or if anybody has any questions on perfectly happy sticking around for a few minutes. Yes?
You mentioned the sensitivity. Is there such a thing as ultra-sensitive victim where any reasonable person would not be offended by that?
Yeah, this is how I handle that question, right? Every organization is different, right? And so you really have to look at it as, if this is harming this individual, now the law says we don't have to get into the most sensitive person, right? We use a reasonable person standard when we're talking about our employment law cases, right? But my question would be, could we give coaching? Could we give training to help? Even if the person was being overly sensitive, because we are in a hypersensitive society right now.
Yeah.
But I always look at it as, how do we coach both people? Not just the person that they're accusing, right? But both people. So we have to coach that person that you're being hypersensitive, but we also have to coach the other person if it's necessary, right? So I'm dealing with a case right now where I'm coaching both and helping them get to that balanced state so that they can continue to work together, right? But we are in a hypersensitive. Look at the world that we live in. People are super sensitive, and we have to be mindful of that as we negotiate this, right? But it is, I mean, the kind of cases you would see coming through my desk right now when I'm coaching and consulting with people, some of them I look at and I'm like, wow, we are at a different time, in a different place. Now, that doesn't mean it's going to be illegal behavior, so we may never see a courthouse, but if we're dealing with the culture and the workplace culture, we're going to have to deal with things differently. Right? Yeah. I don't know if that answers your question.
It does. I mean, whether it's legal or
Yeah.
civil, I mean, whether it's civility. Oh, sorry.
No, you go.
So I guess you differentiate between that, potentially the dichotomy there.
Yeah, that's a huge difference, and that's why I had that spectrum, right? Because most organizations are just focusing on the illegal stuff, but we need to focus on the rest of that and make sure that we stop the behavior early on. So even if the person, let's say in the worst case scenario, the person was being hypersensitive, right? Even if they weren't being we still have to coach that person so that they can continue to work with that manager or that coworker that they're working with. And usually that requires coaching on both of us.
All right. Other questions? No? Sejal, such informative and thoughtful conversation. And also with regards to the being an ally, the API community, they have what we call holler back training or bystander intervention training. So if you see any sorts of hatred actions, they actually give you some ways to help either intervene and de-escalate and those sorts of things. So all great ideas. Sejal, thank you so much.
Yes, and I'll give everybody my business card. Like I do a lot of my trainings now virtually, in person. Reach out to me if I can help. I wanted to give you kind of a scattering of stuff to know what I can cover and what can help you. So reach out if I can help you. Thank you for being here. You're welcome. You already have my number. You already know me. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. Did you do this in the morning as well?